there is feminism and patriarchy. Atwood critiques the oppression of women and the limitations placed on female identity. The protagonist's relationships with men, her lover Joe and her ex husband, exemplify the struggle for female agency. She is pressurized into traditional roles and experiences trauma, particularly regarding her forced abortion. They control us, they decide for us, they are our gods. This line reflects the protagonist's frustration with male dominance and the way women are often deprived of autonomy. Nationalism and Canadian identity, the novel also critiques American cultural imperialism and reflects on the fragile nature of Canadian identity. The protagonist's disdain for American tourists and their destruction of nature landscapes highlights the theme of cultural invention. They own the country, they don't own buying it up, buying even the forest and the lakes, the places they saw in vacation brochures. This commentary criticizes how Americans commercialize and exploit Canada's natural resources. Now, let's talk about the structure of the novel after discussing the themes. It's a three-part narrative. The novel is divided into three sections that reflect the protagonist's psychological progression. Arrival and search for father has to be one, psychological breakdown has to be the second, and then there is a rebirth and transformation in the third. In Arrival and Search for His Father, the protagonist returns to her childhood home with friends, ostensibly to search for her missing father. In the second section, where there is a psychological breakdown, she experiences increasing alienation, leading to hallucination and fragmented thoughts. When there is the third section talking about rebirth and transformation, she embraces a more primal existence, shedding societal norms and reclaiming a more instinctual identity. This tripartite structure mirrors the classic Quest narrative, but instead of a traditional resolution, it ends ambiguously with the protagonist's transformation being more spiritual than tangible. There is a stream of consciousness style. Atwood employs a fragmented and introspective narrated style, often blurring the boundaries between past and present. The non-linear structure reflects the protagonist's psychological disintegration and eventual reconstruction. At times, sentences are abrupt and disconnected. He isn't coming back. None of them are. I have to save myself. This abrupt transition between ideas mirrors her shifting consciousness. The narrative techniques include first person perspective. The novel is told through the protagonist's first person account, immersing readers in her subjective reality. The unreliable nature of her narration forces readers to question what is real and what is hallucination. Symbolism plays a key role in conveying deeper meanings. For example, the lake representing both mystery and clarity, as it hides her father's fate but also serves as a place of revelation. There are markings and drawings, her father's sketches, which reflect an attempt to understand the world through logic, contrasting with the protagonist's intuitive approach. There is water and submersion, the act of diving into water, which is symbolical again of the protagonist's descent into the subconscious and her rebirth. There is a juxtaposition and contrast, where Atwood frequently contrasts civilization with nature, men with women, and the past with the present. These contrasts highlights the protagonist's internal struggle. Joe's hand rough and thick, his face is blank but patient. He waits, he always waits. Here the protagonist contrasts Joe's passive presence with the more aggressive male figures in her past. Talking about characterization, the protagonist, who is an unnamed narrator, a complex introspective woman struggling with trauma and identity. A gradual rejection of societal norms leads to an almost feral state by the novel's end. Her transformation represents a return to a more primal, authentic existence. She strips off her clothes and lives in the wilderness. I lie down on the ground and I'm not an animal or a tree. I'm not a woman. I change. I become a lake. This signals her complete integration with nature, shedding human identity. There is another character called Joe, the protagonist's lover, a quiet and a patient man, who represents a contrast to the more domineering men in her past. Despite his patience, he embodies male expectations of women, especially in his desire for her to say, I love you. There is David and Anna, a dysfunctional couple that highlights gender dynamics. David is controlling and insensitive, constantly humiliating Anna. Anna serves as a foil to the protagonist. She conforms to male expectations but ultimately suffers for it. She said it as if it did not matter, as if her real self had been buried long ago. This description of Anna highlights her loss of agency. There's a father as a character who is a mysterious, absent figure who represents the protagonist's search for truth. His disappearance, excuse me, and cryptic drawings force her to question the boundary between reason and intuition. Margaret Atwood's Surfacing is deeply symbolic and psychological novel that explores themes of identity, feminism, nature, and nationalism. Through its fragmented structure, introspective narration, and rich symbolism, the novel takes the reader on a journey that mirrors the protagonist's descent into her subconscious and eventual rebirth. Atwood challenges conventional ideas of selfhood and belonging, leaving readers with an ambiguous yet profound conclusion. The novel fundamentally is a journey of self exploration. The protagonist's return to her childhood home symbolizes a quest to uncover her past and reconstruct her identity. Throughout the novel, she struggles with a fractured sense of self, exaggerated by personal trauma, relationships, and cultural dislocation. She initially presents herself as detached from emotions, repressing painful memories. However, as the novel progresses, her psychological barriers begin to break down, culminating into a radical rejection of societal norms. The protagonist's transformation is marked by her increasing alignment with nature, where she shades imposed identities and embraces a raw primal existence. They have turned themselves into gods. As soon as they say one thing, they have to say the opposite to balance it. They are inescapable, like the various forms of matter. This line reflects her disillusionment with the rigid structures of identity imposed by society. Nature is depicted as pure, organic, and spiritually reuniting, while civilization is associated with corruption, destruction, and artificiality. The protagonist's increasing immersion in the wilderness parallels her psychological transformation. The lake and the forest represent a deeper instinctive knowledge that exists between the constraints of language and reason. Water represents both concealment and revelation. Her father's disappearance, her own rebirth, and animals serve as a contrast to human behavior. The protagonist envies their unself conscious existence. The novel critiques traditional gender roles and explores the oppression of women, the protagonist's relationship with men. Joe, David, and her ex-husband highlight power imbalances and emotional manipulation. The protagonist's abortion, forced upon her by a past lover, represents male control over female bodies. David's treatment of Anna, publicly humiliating her, controlling her sexuality, exemplifies patriarchally dominant society. By the end of the novel, the protagonist rejects male control by refusing to return to Joe and choosing self isolation instead. This novel represents Canada as a colonized land, struggling to maintain its cultural identity against the encroaching influence of the US. American tourists are portrayed as ignorant, exploitative, and destructive. The protagonist sees Americans as symbolic of the broader force of capitalism and imperialism that threaten both Canada's environment and cultural autonomy. The three-part division, talking about the structure, which is of three distinct sections, where it's divided as the first phase, second phase, and third phase, is absolutely representing a different phase of the protagonist's psychological and emotional transformation. The first phase, where the protagonist arrives at her childhood, where she searches for clues about her father's disappearance, where memories begin to surface but she remains emotionally distant. The second phase, where there is a psychological breakdown, which is also an inner turmoil, which is an increasing tension between the characters. The protagonist begins to recall traumatic memories, including her abortion, where she becomes increasingly detached from her companies, feeling alienated from human interaction. And there is a third phase, which is the rebirth and the transformation, which is a road towards a spiritual journey where she rejects civilization, discards her clothes, and lives in the wilderness, where her identification with nature becomes absolute, symbolizing her rebirth, where the novel ends ambiguously. Will she return to society or remain in the wild? The novel does not follow any linear plot but moves in cycles, reflecting the protagonist's fragmented psyche. Her memories of the past intrude into the present, making the narrative feel like a psychological spiral rather than a straightforward progression. The story begins with the protagonist's journey to the island and ends with her integration into a nature, creating a circular structure. This mirrors the mythic journey of descent and rebirth, common in many spiritual and psychological narratives. The protagonist's past and present intermingle, reflecting her disoriented mental state. Time does not progress logically, rather, it flows in a dreamlike manner, reinforcing her detachment from reality. So, these are some of the features of Unit 11, where we discussed about the characterization, the structure, the themes of the novel Surfacing by Margaret Atwood. And now we talk about the language analysis part, where we discuss about the imagery, we discuss about the symbolism, and we come to know more about um, language, imagery, and symbolism in more details. So, Atwood's prose, this is Unit 12. We begin with Unit 12 now, where we focus on language, imagery, and symbolism in Surfacing by Margaret Atwood. Atwood's prose in Surfacing is deeply introspective, fragmented, and poetic. The novel is narrated in the first person, which enhances the psychological depth and unreliability of the protagonist's perspective. The language shifts from rational and analytical in the beginning to more fluid and dreamlike as the narrator descends into a more primal state. Some of the key features of Atwood's language will include minimalist and stark descriptions. Atwood avoids excessive ornamentation, which mirrors the protagonist's emotional detachment. There is stream of consciousness. The narrative moves through the protagonist's mind, blending past and present. There is ambiguity and allusions, where the novel is filled with subtle references to Canadian identity, colonialism, and feminism, often left open to interpretation. Atwood uses vivid and more often unsettling imagery to reinforce the protagonist's psychological unraveling and the novel's themes of nature, identity, and alienation. Some dominant types of imagery include water and drowning. The lake plays a crucial role representing memory, suppression, and rebirth. The protagonist's father drowned and her own dive into the water symbolizes a return to truth. There is animalistic and primal imagery as the protagonist rejects civilization. She imagines herself merging with animals, especially birds and fish, symbolizing a loss of constructed identity and return to instinct. There is decay and ruins. The isolated cabin and the deteriorating state of the environment reflect both personal and cultural disintegration. Atwood layers the novels with symbols that reflects its deeper themes. There is a nature as a mirror of identity, where the protagonist's relationship with the wilderness mirrors her psychological state. As she moves deeper into nature, she sheds her societal persona, And there is another deeper theme, which is a symbol, which is the skin and the mask motif. The idea of shedding one's skin or wearing a mask appears repeatedly, symbolizing the struggle between authenticity and societal expectations. The body and the femininity, the protagonist's complex relationship with her own body, including a past abortion, symbolizes control, trauma, and the struggle for autonomy. Surfacing is a novel which is rich with thematic complexity, weaving together personal trauma, identity, feminism, nature, and Canadian nationalism. The protagonist of Surfacing undergoes a profound identity crisis, struggling with fragmented memories, and a sense of disconnection from herself and others. Her lack of a name already signals a loss of individuality, and as a novel progresses, her grasp on reality weakens. Memory and repression, the protagonist suppresses key aspects of her past, particularly a traumatic abortion that she only fully acknowledges towards the end of the novel. Her repressed past haunts her, and the act of surfacing it not just literal, diving into the lake to find her father's remains, but psychological, unearthing buried memories. Unreliable narration, Artwood employs a stream of consciousness style that blurs the line between reality and delusion. The protagonist's perception becomes increasingly unreliable as she detaches from society and embraces a more primal existence. There is a split consciousness where she struggles with her internalized guilt, often feeling like a foreigner in her own life. This internal split is symbolized by her changing perception of herself, first as a detached observer, later as an animalistic being merging with nature. There is a rejection of traditional femininity. Throughout the novel, the protagonist feels alienated from traditional female roles. She resents the idea of women being defined by their relationships with men and struggles with societal expectations that dictate how women would behave. A pivotal moment in the novel is the revelation of the protagonist's abortion, which she was pressured into by a former lover. This traumatic event represents the broader theme of female bodily autonomy or lack thereof. Her inability to remember it clearly symbolizes the way society erases and suppresses women's pain. The contrast between forced motherhood and the loss of agency over reproduction is a crucial feminist critique. The men in the novel, for example, Joe, David, and the protagonist's absent father, embody different aspects of patriarchal control. David, in particular, is an overt misogynist, treating his wife Anna as an object and humiliating her. Joe, although less aggressive, still exhibits possessiveness, revealing how male entitlement pervades the relationship. Ultimately, the protagonist rejects both the oppressive gender roles imposed on her and the male figures who seek to control or define her, opting instead for a radical society, solitary self discovery. There is a contrast between nature and civilization, which is central to surfacing, with nature representing purity, truth, and pre-colonial Canadian identity, while civilization is depicted as corrupt, artificial, and alienating. The wilderness as a site of rebirth, where the Canadian wilderness is both a physical and a psychological space for the protagonist's transformation. As she distances herself from human civilization, she undergoes a process of regression, shedding her former identity and returning to a more instinctual, primal state. The protagonist sees the encroachment of modernity, development, and American influences as a form of colonial destruction. This connects to Canada's post colonial struggle for identity, where foreign influences is seen as a corrupting force. The lake, which holds the mystery of her father's disappearance, symbolizes hidden truths and self discovery. Her final act of diving beneath the water represents a descent into the subconsciousness, and attempt to retrieve a lost part of herself. Atwood critiques both Canadian nationalism and American cultural imperialism, positioning Canada as a country struggling to define itself. The novel repeatedly references Americans as invaders, whether they are literal tourists disrupting the wilderness or symbols of a larger, more aggressive cultural force. The protagonist resent American influence, seeing it as destructive and superficial. The protagonist's father, a researcher studying indigenous rock paintings, represents a connection to an older, more authentic Canadian identity. However, even this identity is complete. The protagonist never fully understands his work, just as she struggles to define her own place within Canada's national identity. The protagonist's retreat into nature mirrors a broader Canadian mythos that views the wilderness as an essential part of the national consciousness. However, Atwood complicates this idea, showing that nature alone cannot provide a stable identity. It must be reconciled with personal and historical truth. The novel is structured as a psychological mystery where the protagonist must confront repressed trauma to achieve any sense of clarity. The search of a missing father serves as an external representation of the protagonist's internal search for meaning. His vanishing mirrors her own loss of identity, and finding his remains in the symbolic of as the protagonist withdraws from human civilization, she embraces a form of madness. She strips off her clothes, communicates with animals, and views herself as merging with nature. While this could have been seen as a breakdown, it is also presented as a form of liberation from the constraints of modern life. The title itself represents multiple layers of meaning, resurfacing from psychological repression, emerging from societal expectations, and confronting the past to reclaim one's truer self. Overall, Surfacing is a novel that intertwines personal and national and feminist themes to explore the complexities of identity, trauma, and self discovery. Artwood uses symbolism, psychological depth, and environmental imagery to depict a woman's journey towards self realization. The novel ultimately questions whether true escape from societal constraints is possible and whether identity can be reclaimed or must be entirely reinvented. So, we are done with Unit 11 and Unit 12. Let's discuss some important questions. In 11, Unit 11, some of the important questions that can be discussed are the first question: comment on the overall thematic thrust of surfacing. So, the central thematic thrust of surfacing revolves around identity, alienation, feminism, and the conflict between nature and civilization. The novel is a psychological and existential journey where the protagonist seeks self knowledge by returning to her childhood home in the Canadian wilderness. There is a search for identity where the protagonist struggles with her fragmented sense of self stemming from repressed trauma, societal expectations, and the influence of colonial and patriarchal structures. Her journey becomes one of psychological resurfacing where she confronts past trauma and attempts to reclaim a more authentic existence. Atwood critiques the power dynamics between men and women, where the second thematic point which props up is towards feminism and gender critique. The protagonist's relationship with men, her lover Joe, the chauvinistic David, and her absent father, which highlights the ways in which women are expected to conform to male expectations. By the end, she rejects both traditional roles and the men in her life, seeking a more primal, autonomous existence. The novel contrasts the purity and the truth of nature with the corruption of modern civilization. The protagonist sees Americans' tourist and technological encroachments as threats to both the physical landscape and the deeper spiritual identity of the land. Her eventual immersion into nature suggests a return to something more instinctive and real. The novel subtly critiques Canadian identity in the face of American cultural dominion. The protagonist resents American influence and sees her father's research on indigenous petroglyphs as an attempt to connect with an older pre colonial Canada. So, the second question is structurally, what are the three broad sections into which surfacing can be divided? Now, structurally, surfacing can be divided into three sections. The return to the past, which almost covers chapter 1 to 8, which talks about the exploration and discovery, which talks about the protagonist's arrival to her childhood home with Joe, David, and Anna, where she searches for her missing father, whose absence is a mystery, where she revisits childhood memories and begins to feel disconnected from her present life. The tension in her relationship with Joe and toxic dynamic between David and Anna highlight gender struggles. There is a section of rationality structured and filled up with external observations. Then we have section 2, which is about repression and unraveling, which talks about the psychological breakdown where she slowly realizes that she has repressed key events of her life, including her abortion. The divide between her internal self and an external world deepens. David tries to exploit her sexually, which contributes to her growing detachment from men and civilization. She questions societal norms and starts feeling more connected to nature than people. Then we have a third section, that is rebirth and transformation, again which talks about regression and renewal. She rejects civilization entirely, staying alone in the wilderness. She discards her clothes and language, living like an animal, believing she is merging with the land. She hallucinates about her parents and undergoes a symbolic rebirth. The novel ends ambiguously. She considers returning to society, but in a changed form, having rejected past constraints. So these are the three sections that mirror into a descent into the subconsciousness, culminating into a ritualistic rebirth where the protagonist redefines herself. Now there can be a third question, comment on Atwood's handling of characterization in surfacing. And here, Atwood's character in surfacing are not fully fleshed out individuals, but rather symbolic representation of broader societal forces. This fits with the novel's psychological and the thematic depth, as the focus is more on the protagonist's internal transformation than on integrate character development. There's a protagonist, unnamed narrator, where Atwood deliberately keeps her unnamed, emphasizing her loss of identity and alienation. She is emotionally detached at the beginning, a defense mechanism against past trauma. Her gradual psychological breakdown, which is handled with subtlety as her narration shifts from rational reflection to a fragmented, hallucinatory style. By the end, she undergoes a symbolic transformation, rejecting societal norms in favor of a more primal existence. Then we have Joe, the passive male figure, who represents an indifferent passive masculinity. He's emotionally closed off and struggles to communicate. He expects commitment from the protagonist without truly understanding her, and his lack of language skills, where he's described as unarticulate, symbolizes how men in the novel fail to engage emotionally. Then we have David, the patriarchal oppressor. David is a misogynist, treating his wife Anna as an object of sexual control. He tries to manipulate the protagonist into sexual submission. His obsession with power, control, and his degrading treatment of Anna highlights the worst aspects of male dominance in relationships. Then we have Anna, the oppressed woman, who seemingly confident is trapped in a toxic marriage, constantly seeking David's approval despite his cruel treatment of her. She represents the way many women are conditioned to accept patriarchal oppression, unlike the protagonist who eventually rejects it. So, these are the three important questions from Unit 11. We have some of the important questions from Unit 12 too. And here we discuss about the poetic, what is poetic about the style and language of surfacing. And this is the first question under Unit 12. And how does the use of symbols reinforce the thematic side of surfacing? Margaret Atwood's prose in surfacing has um, a distinctively poetic quality, which enhances the novel's introspective and symbolical depth. This poeticism emerges through various literary techniques, including stream of consciousness and repetition, fragmentation, and vivid imagery. The novel narrative flows in a non-linear, fragmented manner, mirroring the protagonist's psychological state. Thoughts blend together, much like in poetry, where structure is often fluid rather than rigid. The shifting between past and present creates an almost dreamlike quality, making the novel feel like an extended prose poem. Atwood frequently repeats words and phrases, giving the text a rhythmic, incantatory feeling. The minimalistic style, short declarative sentences, intensifies the raw emotions and the protagonist alienation. The novel is filled with striking sensory description um, of nature, reinforcing its symbolic power. Water, trees, animals, and light are described with poetic intensity, often acting as metaphors for transformation and identity. The lake is quiet, the trees around it, their reflection float on it like weeds. I'm not afraid of the mirror, it's not my enemy anymore. This passage only captures the serenity of the landscape, but also conveys a deeper psychological shift. Now, coming to the second question, what is the role of symbols in reinforcing themes? Artwork surfacing is rich in symbolism, with key images and motifs reinforcing the novel's major themes of identity, feminism, and nature and national consciousness. Water and drowning can be one of the theme, which is talks about truth, memory, and rebirth. Water, which is both literal and metaphorical element of discovery. The protagonist dives into the lakes, searching for her father's body, paralleling her deep dive into her own consciousness. Drowning symbolizes the fear of confronting hidden truths. Her emergence from the lake at the end represents rebirth, echoing the novel's title. The untouched Canadian wilderness symbolizes purity and authenticity. The protagonist's increasing connection to the wild, eventually stripping off her clothes and living like an animal, shows her rejection of societal norms. The protagonist frequently refers to layers of skin or masks, indicating her struggle with identity. Anna, who wears makeup to please David, represents a woman trapped behind a false exterior, while the protagonist ultimately rejects such performative roles. By the end, their symbolical shades all mask both physical and psychological, her detachment, her constructed identity. The protagonist's identification with animals signifies her departure from human civilization. She imagines herself growing fur, feeling a connection to pre human existence. This regression is both a breakdown and a liberation. The father's absence and his research The protagonist's father, who studied indigenous rock paintings, represents a search for deeper cultural roots in Canada's history. His disappearance and death parallel the protagonist's own crisis of identity. Both are in search of something lost. The rock paintings themselves symbolize an ancient, suppressed knowledge, much like the protagonist's own repressed memories. So, we are done discussing Unit 12 questions also. And in conclusion, we come to know outward surfacing is poetic in its structure, language, and symbolic in its themes, which uses vivid imagery and fragmented narration to reflect the protagonist's psychological journey. The use of symbols like water, wilderness, mask, animal, and the absent father reinforces the novel's central themes of identity, feminism, nature, and national consciousness. These elements work together to create a novel that is not just about an individual's crisis, but about broader cultural existential questions. So we are done with surfacing and we are done with block 3. We start with the block 4 tomorrow, which is about teen flute. We start with unit 13 tomorrow, which is again French Canadian writing, especially an introduction to Quebec. That is what we are going to discuss tomorrow. And then followed by we discuss unit 14, where we study Gabriel Roy life and works, and this is where we discuss unit 14. So yeah, thank you. So we are done for the day. Thank you so much.